It was supposed to be a peaceful return home, a quiet morning of unloading suitcases and helping my mother settle in after her back surgery. The sun bathed the street in golden light, birds chirped cheerfully, and the neighborhood of Pine Crest Estates looked as pristine as ever. But as I pulled into the driveway, gently assisting my mom from the car, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that someone was watching us. Sure enough, across the street, there she stood, Deborah Williams. Arms folded across her perfectly pressed white blazer, lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'd seen that look before. It wasn't friendliness, it was the look of someone calculating her next move. My mom leaned on me, wincing slightly as we shuffled toward the house. "Is she always out there like that?" she whispered, catching Deborah's stare. I nodded. "That's Deborah, HOA president. Thinks she owns the whole neighborhood." Mom chuckled faintly, not yet understanding how serious I was. "Well," she sighed, "let's just stay under the radar. No need to stir anything up." If only it were that easy. The next morning, before I could even pour myself a cup of coffee, I found a bright orange paper taped aggressively to our front door. Violation notice. Unauthorized resident. Fine. $100 day until resolved. My stomach sank. I tore it down before Mom could see it. The last thing she needed during recovery was unnecessary stress from a woman with too much power and too little compassion. "She's just staying temporarily," I muttered under my breath. "It's not like I moved in a circus." I tried to brush it off. Surely this was just a misunderstanding, some overly enthusiastic rule follower getting ahead of herself. I planned to speak calmly with the board and clarify that this was a family medical situation. Reasonable people would understand, right? But by that afternoon, my phone started lighting up with texts from Tom, the only sane member on the HOA board. "Deborah just called an emergency board meeting about your mom. She's claiming your medical equipment is an eyesore that violates aesthetic guidelines. Watch your back." When I peeked through the curtains, there she was again. Deborah, clipboard in hand, knocking on doors, whispering to neighbors while pointing at our house like it was the scene of a crime. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much free time. This was a campaign. What I didn't know then, what no one could have known, was that this seemingly harmless HOA feud was just the tip of something much darker. A power struggle, a community on the edge, and a secret about my mother that would change everything. All it took was one ignored violation notice, and Pine Crest Estates would never be the same again. I wish I could say it all stopped with that orange notice on my door, but that was only Deborah's opening move. By the end of the week, the situation had spiraled from ridiculous to downright hostile. The second notice came 3 days later, this time printed in bold red letters across the top. Final warning. Unauthorized equipment on premises. I nearly crumpled it in my hands from pure rage. They had included a list, an actual inventory, of everything they claimed was in violation. A hospital bed, oxygen tanks, mobility aid devices, equipment my mother needed to survive. According to Deborah and her band of rule-obsessed sycophants, these life-saving tools were detrimental to the aesthetic cohesion of the neighborhood. I could barely believe what I was reading. That same afternoon, while I was helping Mom with her physical therapy stretches, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Deborah on my porch again, this time with 2 other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards. Their matching clipboards were clutched tightly, ready for battle. "We need to inspect the interior," Deborah said without so much as a hello, "and interview the new resident to determine if her stay qualifies under HOA guidelines." "You're not setting 1 foot in this house," I snapped, stepping outside and slamming the door behind me. Her eyes narrowed. Per Bylaw 4.2, board members have the right to inspect properties under investigation. She is my mother. She just had major surgery. She is not a new tenant. She's recovering from a medical emergency. "Recovery is no excuse for non-compliance," Deborah said with a smug shrug. "We've had neighbors ask about the machines they've seen through your windows. They're uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable? Are you serious?" My voice was shaking with anger. So now being sick is a violation of the neighborhood aesthetic? That tone will only make things worse, one of the board members muttered, scribbling something on his clipboard. This behavior will be documented. You want to document something? I seethed. Document this. If you keep harassing us, I'll be filing my own paperwork with a lawyer. But they didn't care. They never did. That evening, I caught Deborah standing across the street with her phone raised, snapping photos of our living room through the window while my mother napped on the couch. She didn't even try to hide it, just smiled that same icy smile and walked away. I stayed up half the night, pacing the floor and fighting the urge to scream. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was personal. It was about control. Deborah was used to getting her way, and anyone who resisted was punished. I'd heard the stories, the Johnsons fined for their bird bath, the Lopez kids banned from chalk drawings on the sidewalk, the elderly couple down the road threatened with foreclosure over a mailbox color. Now it was my turn. And the worst part? My mother still didn't know the full extent of it. I couldn't bear to tell her. She was already struggling to sleep through the night, waking up short of breath, adjusting to new medications. Her health came first, but I could feel the pressure building. This neighborhood, this board, they were crossing lines. Legal lines, moral lines. By the time the third notice came, this one threatening $250 daily fines and board-led enforcement action, I knew we were at war. But Deborah had made one critical mistake. She assumed my mom was just another frail woman to push around. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Not yet. It started with a gasp. A shallow, rasping sound that yanked me from half-sleep at 3:08 a.m. I bolted upright, my heart already racing before my brain even caught up. Mom. The oxygen monitor at her bedside was screaming in angry, urgent beeps. Her body was curled inward, clutching her chest, mouth open, eyes wide with fear, like she was drowning in the very air around her. Mom! I scrambled out of the makeshift cot I'd placed next to her bed, nearly tripping on the IV line. Hang on, I'm calling for help. My fingers fumbled with the phone. The 911 dispatcher's voice was calm, but every second felt like a lifetime. My mother can't breathe, she's post-op, heart and lung complications. Please send help now. Help is on the way, the operator assured. ETA is 6 minutes. I hung up and flew down the hallway, flinging open the porch door to light up the driveway and guide the ambulance in. I turned on every floodlight we had, waving my arms like a madman. Then I saw it. A giant, gleaming black SUV. Deborah's Escalade. Parked sideways across my driveway, completely blocking it. I froze for a split second, my brain refusing to believe what my eyes were seeing. The same woman who had spent weeks waging a war over unauthorized residents and medical aesthetic violations had now physically blocked emergency responders from reaching my dying mother. Red and blue lights flickered at the end of the street. The ambulance slowed to a confused stop, unable to enter. I sprinted to the edge of the lawn and waved them in, pointing frantically. You'll have to park out here. Someone is blocking the driveway. The paramedics jumped into action, yanking the stretcher out of the back and charging down the sidewalk. I didn't wait. I ran straight to Deborah's house and pounded on the door like a lunatic. It took her almost a full minute to appear. She opened the door in a silk robe and face mask, curlers still nestled in her perfectly styled hair. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she hissed, as if I were disturbing her beauty sleep. "You're blocking my driveway!" I shouted, pointing. "My mom, she's dying. Move your car." Deborah glanced over my shoulder, noticed the ambulance and the stretcher, then calmly leaned against the doorframe. "This is a private community. Commercial vehicles require 48-hour written notice. It's in the bylaws." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's an ambulance!" I screamed. "My mother is gasping for air while you're quoting bylaws?" She shrugged, completely unfazed. "Actions have consequences." Behind me, the paramedics were struggling to wheel the stretcher across the uneven lawn. One of them cursed as the wheels caught in the soft grass, forcing them to lift the whole thing and maneuver around a sprinkler head. "Lady," one paramedic snapped, You are interfering with emergency services. That's a crime. Deborah actually laughed. With what authority? She smirked. I'm the HOA president. Then it happened. As the paramedics reached the porch, Mom's body trembled. Her oxygen mask was slipping. Her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. She reached into the purse I'd brought from her room and pointed, barely conscious, toward her wallet. I unzipped it, confused, and pulled it open. A flash of gold. There, nestled beside her license, was a badge. Sandra Martinez, Chief of Police, Boston PD. I turned, fire surging through my veins, and held it up so the badge gleamed under the porch light. Deborah, meet my mother. Her jaw dropped. The paramedic's eyes widened. Chief Martinez? I turned to him. Transport her, now. I'll deal with this. He nodded and radioed dispatch. This is EMS Unit 6. We're transporting Chief Sandra Martinez, requesting full police escort and priority clearance. Deborah paled, stumbling backward as sirens howled in the distance. The fury drained from her face, replaced by the one thing I had never seen in her expression before: fear. The ambulance lights reflected in her wide eyes as the crew loaded Mom and began to wheel her away. You didn't tell me she was the police chief, Deborah stammered. Didn't think I needed to, I said, my voice hard. You don't get to decide whose life matters based on your HOA rulebook. As the ambulance peeled out and police cruisers came screeching around the corner, I looked back one last time. For once, Deborah had nothing to say. But this war? It was just getting started. The ambulance ride to Boston General felt like a blur. Siren wailing, lights flashing, my hand gripping Mom's as she faded in and out of consciousness. Her breathing had stabilized thanks to the oxygen, but she still looked pale, fragile, far from the woman I'd always known to be so strong and commanding. I kept whispering, "You're okay, you're safe," more to convince myself than her. When we arrived at the ER, I was shocked to see a line of police officers standing at attention outside. As the doors swung open, a uniformed hospital administrator stepped forward with a trauma team in tow. I barely had time to process the fact that someone had clearly alerted the force. My mom wasn't just a patient, she was the chief. News must have traveled fast. They wheeled her in like a dignitary, and in that moment, I finally understood. Mom wasn't just my rock, my protector, my stubborn, proud mother. She was someone important, someone powerful, and someone these people respected deeply. The reality hit me like a tidal wave. Deborah hadn't just blocked an ambulance. She had obstructed emergency medical services for the chief of police. And that meant serious legal consequences. I sat in the waiting room for hours, nerves raw, unable to rest. Around 5 a.m., the doctor finally came out and assured me that Mom was stable. Relief washed over me like warm sunlight after a hurricane. But the real storm was just beginning. When I entered her hospital room, she looked weak, but her eyes were clear, sharp even. "Did they arrest her?" she asked, skipping past greetings. Typical Mom. "Deborah? I don't know," I said. "I've been here with you all night." "Call Jenkins," she ordered, already reaching for the hospital phone. "Tell him everything. Make it official." Within hours, 3 cruisers were lined up outside our neighborhood. Neighbors in pajamas stood on porches whispering, coffee mugs in hand, eyes wide with speculation. Word had spread that the HOA president had blocked a medical emergency. But no one yet knew who the patient had been. Until now. Officer Jenkins, Mom's right hand for 15 years, stepped out of his car and called out to me, "How's the chief?" "She's stable, furious, but stable." He nodded, then turned to the growing crowd. "We're collecting witness statements. Obstructing emergency services is a felony." Deborah's smugness evaporated the moment she saw the cruisers. And when they cuffed her in front of everyone, the neighborhood fell utterly silent. Her protests about bylaws and misunderstandings and community standards meant nothing anymore. This wasn't an HOA dispute. This was criminal obstruction against a public official. As they placed her in the back of the police car, the whispers turned to full-blown conversation. Neighbors began stepping forward, one by one, telling their stories. Stories of fines, harassment, threats for minor violations like mailbox paint colors or garden gnomes. It was as if Deborah's reign of quiet terror had cracked wide open, and my mom's emergency was the catalyst. Inside our house, I sat with Frank, Deborah's husband, as he played a video Deborah had recorded of the incident. Her voice was smug, dismissive. You could hear sirens wailing, me shouting about my mom, and Deborah calmly stating, "Should have followed the rules." It was damning. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. Later that day, the HOA attorney showed up on my doorstep, sweaty, nervous, rambling about apologies and resolutions, but I didn't want a payoff. I wanted change, and I wanted everyone to know the truth. Power misused is never harmless. That night, I posted a photo of Mom in her uniform, standing tall, medals shining. The caption was simple. She nearly died because someone thought rules were more important than lives. She also saved this neighborhood without lifting a finger. Chief Sandra Martinez, my mother. The post exploded, and so did the illusion of Deborah's control. This wasn't just a turning point in our story, it was a turning point for our entire community. Because now, everyone knew who they had messed with, and what happens when justice wears a badge. By the time I returned from the hospital the next morning, the quiet cul-de-sac I once called home looked like the set of a crime drama. 3 police cruisers, lights flashing, lined the street outside our house. Yellow caution tape cordoned off the front yard where the ambulance had been forced to detour through the grass. Neighbors stood on their porches, still in pajamas and robes, coffee mugs clutched tightly, whispering to one another in disbelief. Some were filming. Others just watched in stunned silence. Officer Jenkins spotted me the moment I stepped out of my car. He didn't even wait for me to approach. "How's the chief?" he asked, his voice firm but filled with concern. "She's stable," I said, the weight of the past 24 hours finally catching up with me. "But furious." He nodded grimly. "She has every right to be." Then he turned and faced the gathering crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are collecting official witness statements regarding the obstruction of emergency medical services that occurred last night. Obstruction of EMS is a felony offense under state law. If any of you saw or heard anything, now is the time to speak up." That was all it took. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Patel, from across the street, claimed she saw Deborah standing at her window while the ambulance struggled to find a way in. Tom, the only board member with any backbone, handed Jenkins a flash drive containing security footage from his doorbell camera, showing the entire event. Others, emboldened by the shift in momentum, came forward with stories of harassment, of petty fines and power trips that stretched back years. And then, Deborah stepped outside. Her perfect hair was undone. Her designer robe looked less like a luxury and more like a costume from a play that had just ended. Her face, normally so composed and smug, was ghostly pale. "Officer Jenkins!" she called out, her voice trembling just enough to betray the panic beneath. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding. I was simply enforcing our community regulations. That family has been in violation for weeks." "Ma'am," Jenkins interrupted, his tone sharp as a blade. "You deliberately blocked emergency access to a critically ill resident. That action could have cost someone their life. And now we know that resident is Chief Sandra Martinez." Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Another officer stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for obstruction of emergency services. You have the right to remain silent." The words echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. The neighborhood watched, frozen, as Deborah, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, was handcuffed on her own front lawn. Her husband, Frank, stood nearby, looking utterly defeated. "She didn't know," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. "She didn't know who she was dealing with." "That's not the point," I said quietly. "It shouldn't have mattered who my mother was." As they led Deborah toward the waiting cruiser, her eyes locked with mine. There was no more arrogance, no more power, only fear. The realization had finally hit her. She hadn't just broken some rule or overstepped her authority. She had crossed a line, and now the law was coming down on her with the full weight of justice. The cruiser door shut with a heavy clunk. Neighbors whispered. Some applauded. Others just stared, finally seeing the tyrant for what she really was. Deborah Williams, the once feared president of Pine Crest Estates HOA, was now a criminal suspect in custody. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it could finally breathe. The community center was packed, standing room only. Rows of plastic chairs creaked under the weight of tension, and even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Neighbors, who had never once attended an HOA meeting, now sat on the edge of their seats, whispering about the storm that had shaken Pine Crest Estates to its core. Everyone knew what was about to happen, but no one expected the force behind it to walk in through the double doors, standing tall, wrapped in navy blue, and wearing a badge that demanded silence. Chief Sandra Martinez, my mother, stepped into the room. Flanked by me and Officer Jenkins, her longtime deputy, Mom walked with a slow, deliberate grace that silenced the room instantly. Though still recovering from her emergency hospitalization, her uniform was crisp, her gaze razor-sharp. The oxygen tank wheeled behind her, whispered with each breath, a reminder of what she'd endured and what had brought us here. At the front table sat the entire HOA board, minus Deborah Williams, who now occupied the furthest corner, her once impeccable bob limp, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked like a statue of defiance chipped by scandal. The board president, Jeff Wilson, cleared his throat nervously and banged the gavel. "This emergency meeting is now in session," he said, his voice barely steady. "We're here to address last week's incident involving board member Williams and Chief Martinez." "The floor is yours, Chief." Mom rose slowly from her seat, taking her time to reach the podium. The room was so silent, you could hear the gentle hiss of her oxygen. She didn't need a microphone. "My name is Sandra Martinez," she said. "I've served the city of Boston as a police officer for 27 years. I've seen shootings, riots, protests, and acts of heroism. But never, never did I think I'd be fighting for my life on my own front lawn, blocked from help by a woman citing lawn decor regulations." The room erupted into low murmurs. "Last Thursday, I couldn't breathe. I was minutes away from cardiac arrest. An ambulance was called, but instead of receiving emergency care, I was treated like a trespasser. Paramedics had to wheel me around the block because Mrs. Deborah Williams refused to move her SUV. While I gasped for air, she stood outside, writing a violation notice." Mom pulled a document from her briefcase and held it high. "This," she said, "is sworn testimony from the paramedics who tried to save me, and this," she held up another, "is a copy of the HOA bylaws. Nowhere in here does it say HOA authority supersedes emergency services. Nowhere." A few people clapped. Others gasped. All eyes turned to Deborah. "I'm not here to demand vengeance," Mom continued. "I'm here to demand change, reasonable change, human change. Medical emergencies are not code violations. Oxygen tanks are not eyesores. Family caretakers are not threats to property values. What happened to me cannot happen again." She laid a folder on the table. "These are model emergency protocols adopted by HOAs across the country. They include no fines for medical equipment, no harassment of temporary medical guests, and above all, a mandate to never obstruct emergency vehicles. I propose we adopt them immediately," the board whispered among themselves. Deborah, finally breaking her silence, shot to her feet. "This is outrageous," she cried. "She's twisting the narrative. I was upholding the rules we all agreed to when we moved in. She violated occupancy limits, brought in unauthorized equipment. She never once notified the board. She was fighting for her life," I shouted, stepping forward. "And you were worried about her hospital bed violating HOA aesthetic standards." The room stirred. Tom, our neighbor, stood. "I saw the whole thing," he said. Deborah was outside yelling about bylaws while the medics were struggling to get her through the yard. She blocked an ambulance. "That's not a rule. That's a felony." Jeff raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Enough," he said. "Board members, show of hands. Do we support Chief Martinez's proposal?" Hands rose, everyone but Deborah's. "Motion passes," Jeff said. "Effective immediately." "And what about Deborah?" someone called from the back. "She tried to kill the chief." Before Jeff could speak, Officer Jenkins stepped forward. An investigation is already underway. Obstruction of emergency services is a state crime. We'll be handling that. Deborah turned pale. You're making a mistake, she muttered, backing away. No, Mom said, turning to face her. You did, and the neighborhood won't pay the price for it anymore. As the gavel fell and the room erupted into applause, I looked at my mother, stoic, composed, victorious. In that moment, I realized it wasn't her badge that gave her power. It was her refusal to back down. 2 weeks after the community meeting that changed everything, something in Pine Crest Estates felt different, lighter, quieter, as if a collective exhale had finally been released after years of tension. Deborah Williams' once meticulously maintained house now stood empty, a large for sale sign planted in the front yard. The silence around it was deafening, not out of respect, but relief. Neighbors no longer crossed the street to avoid each other or whispered behind closed doors. For the first time in years, people waved freely, stopped for real conversations, and asked about each other's families, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. My mom, Chief Sandra Martinez, had become an unlikely hero, not just for her badge, but for her bravery as a daughter, a neighbor, and a voice of reason in a place that had forgotten how to listen. The HOA, once feared like a shadowy government, now met with open doors and open hearts. The newly instated Martinez safety protocols were unanimously adopted by the revised board. No more harassment over medical equipment, no more fines for family emergencies, and a new community-wide emergency access policy that ensured no home would ever be blocked in a moment of crisis again. At the center of it all was my mother. Even while recovering, she volunteered to help guide the board through rewriting outdated rules, some of which hadn't been touched in over a decade. Her decades of law enforcement experience brought clarity and compassion that Pine Crest had desperately needed. And the board, to their credit, listened. For once, the HOA wasn't about control. It was about care. The most touching moment came during a Saturday afternoon block gathering. Tables lined the cul-de-sac, covered in homemade casseroles, lemonade pitchers, and store-bought cookies that no one dared criticize. Kids played tag without anyone shushing them. Laughter echoed down the street. Jeff Wilson, the new HOA president, stood up with a microphone in hand. We've been through a lot, he said, voice thick with emotion. But today, we're not just neighbors. We're a community again. And it's because one woman reminded us what really matters. He gestured toward my mom, who sat beside me in a lawn chair, wrapped in a soft shawl, her oxygen tank beside her. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people even stood. I saw tears in more than a few eyes, including my own. We're naming the new emergency response policy after her, Jeff continued. The Martinez Initiative, because this neighborhood doesn't just belong to bylaws, it belongs to the people who live here. Mom looked overwhelmed. She never liked attention. But that day, she let the applause wash over her. She deserved every second of it. Afterward, neighbors approached us with stories we'd never heard. An elderly couple shared how Deborah had once threatened to fine them for leaving a cane on the porch. A single mom said she'd been afraid to ask for help when her son needed a breathing machine. But now they felt seen, safe, even hopeful. This is what a neighborhood is supposed to be, Tom said, clinking a soda can against mine. People looking out for each other, not looking for violations. I nodded, watching the kids chase each other between lawn chairs. We didn't just stop something bad, I replied. We started something good. And that's what stuck with me most. Change hadn't come easy. It came with resistance, anger, and fear. But when truth stood tall and courage stepped forward, something remarkable happened. People listened. And then they joined in. Mom would eventually return to her own home across town, but her presence remained, etched in every new policy, every kind interaction, every shared smile. And as the sun set over our newly united cul-de-sac, I knew Pine Crest Estates would never be the same again. It would be better. Because for the first time, it was truly ours. At the heart of this story lies a powerful reminder. one that resonates deeply with anyone who has lived long enough to understand the value of dignity, compassion, and community. What happened in Pine Crest Estates wasn't just about one woman's misuse of authority or a neighborhood dispute over HOA bylaws. It was a reflection of something many of us have seen over the years: how quickly rules, when left unchecked, can become walls instead of bridges, and how easily people forget that beneath every front door lies a life, a story, and a family doing their best. The actions of Chief Martinez and her daughter taught us that courage doesn't always come with a badge. It often starts with love. The kind of love that makes you stand up, even when your knees shake, to protect someone who can't fight for themselves. Many seniors know this feeling all too well. The need to speak up when others stay silent, to challenge what feels wrong even when it's uncomfortable. One of the most profound lessons from this tale is that being a good neighbor doesn't mean enforcing the rules. It means caring for the people who live beside you. It reminds us that authority without empathy is dangerous. Deborah, the HOA president, had become so obsessed with structure and control that she lost sight of the people those rules were meant to serve. But when a life hung in the balance, it wasn't policy that mattered. It was compassion. For older adults who have spent decades raising families, contributing to society, and watching the world change, this story validates something we've always known. You don't need power to make a difference. You just need principles. Another key takeaway is the importance of community solidarity. It wasn't just Chief Martinez who made the change. It was her neighbors who stood with her once they saw the truth. Tom, the kind-hearted neighbor, the crowd that demanded accountability, the board members who listened, all of them reminded us that when we come together, real change is not only possible, it's inevitable. And perhaps most moving of all was the realization that legacies aren't built through titles, they're built through actions. Chief Martinez didn't ask for recognition. She fought because someone she loved needed her. And in doing so, she left behind a safer, kinder, and more respectful community for everyone, especially for those who feel most vulnerable. For seniors who may sometimes feel overlooked or underestimated, this story is a testament. Your wisdom, your resilience, and your voice still matter. So whether you're caring for someone you love, navigating your own HOA challenges, or simply trying to live in peace, you have the power to influence the world around you. Because the true strength of a neighborhood or any community isn't found in its rules. It's found in how we treat each other when no one is watching. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.